Click on that.
I do.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can still hear you.
You can hear me? Okay, good.
Yes,
We got
ma'am.
it.
Okay.
Come on.
I think because we're hosts, we can also mute people if you can't find the mute button on all of our different
That
devices.
would be great if you could,
Yeah, I'll help
you could do that.
so I can help
Okay.
Charlotte if she. Yeah, there you go.
Thank
If you
you.
wiggle
Thank
around the mouse, probably the mute button will appear on
Right.
the frame of your screen.
Right. So folks, we're going to ask that you do mute your microphones to reduce background noise, but if you can't find out how to do it, we can do it from our side. So if you can't mute, not to worry, we'll take care of muting you in a few moments. So I'm just going to make these quick announcements. Here's what your mute button looks like on the left when you're not muted, and on the right, this is what it looks like when you are muted. It has a red line through the microphone to show that you are muted. Okay, so
What? Yeah, I know it's backwards.
if it does seem backwards, but what you would do is if you wanted to unmute, you would hit the one that says unmute, and that would unmute you. So welcome to the real world of technology. It's confusing, but just remember, you're only muted if you can see the red line, which means no. So here's what we're going to do for questions today. We're going to ask them at the end of the discussion. Please indicate if your question is for a specific panelist. We have people watching the live stream in YouTube, and we also have, of course, all of you here in Zoom. If you're here in Zoom, you can type your question into chat. Or if you prefer to ask it in person, you can unmute your microphone and wait to be recognized. So if you unmute, then please stay quiet until you're recognized. It will bring you to the top of the list, and we'll know that you want to ask a question because your name will move up on the list, and we'll see that your microphone is unmuted. It's actually easier for you to just type your question into chat. And remember that we don't have time to go back and forth and have a discussion on the questions since we're limited to just an hour. If you're watching us live in YouTube, then enter your question in the live chat on YouTube, and we will monitor it and make sure that your question gets asked. As always, we'll post the video recordings of this panel discussion tomorrow. We'll post it both in Facebook and YouTube. And to find those, you can go to our website, lwvpba.org, and you can just use the YouTube and Facebook buttons that you'll find in the upper right corner of any page on our website. So at this point, let me turn the meeting back over to Haley, who is serving as Haley Richards, who is serving as our moderator tonight.
All right. Well, good evening, everybody. It's nice to see some familiar faces that I haven't seen in a while. And so welcome. So this is our first hot topic of kind of our new league year, and we're going to be talking about critical race theory, what it is and what it is not. And so we have a great panel for you to hear from, and then be able to, as Mary Louise said, ask some questions of the panelists. So I'm going to do some brief introductions, and then we're going to have Dr. Karen Barber speak first, and then we'll proceed with the our other panelists from there. So I'm going to switch over and look at bios here. All right. So Dr. Karen Barber currently serves as the superintendent of schools for Santa Rosa County School District. As an educator for 33 years, she has served as a teacher, school principal, adjunct professor for UWF, and for the last 12 years was the director of federal programs, where she was able to develop many programs and services to meet the needs of at-risk youth. And so there were several of those that she's listed in her bio, but just due to time, I'm not going to read all of those. And then she has been recognized for her collaboration with the community, providing leadership as the president of the Homeless Coalition, Kiwanis, YMCA, ARC Santa Rosa. She's also been the past president and founder of Santa Rosa's Bridges Out of Poverty, a 501c3 focused on building resources for children and families in Santa Rosa County. Dr. Barber's recognitions include Florida's Innovative Technology Principal of the Year for the state of Florida in 2008, the University of West Florida's Distinguished Alumni Award 2019 and 2011. She also received the Department of Children and Families Community Partner of the Year Award for 2018, Santa Rosa County Chamber of Commerce Community Leader of the Year, as well as the Escarosa Coalition on the Homeless Grassroots Leadership Award from 2013. And then one of our next panelists is Rosalind Fisher. She's a professor of sociology at the University of West Florida. She holds master's degrees in both community development and a master's degree in sociology, one from the University of Southern Illinois and one from the University of Kansas. She has over 30 years in the human resources and equal opportunity fields, as well as experience as a mediator for the city of Kansas City, Missouri, and a teacher of women's studies, social problems, and other sociology classes at the University of West Florida. She was the 2015 recipient of the Mary Rogers Outstanding Teacher Award in Women's Studies. Her teaching reflects her commitment to gender equality, social justice, and human rights. Rosalind is a Christian and active member of Bethel AME Church, serving in the Women's Missionary Society, helping with reducing food insecurity by assisting with food distributions to the community, and serving on the Bethel AME Church Social Justice Committee. She's also written short stories, which have been published in regional chapbooks, such as the Emerald Coast Review. She is also a contributing author with several short stories included in the anthology of books published by the African American Heritage Society, When Black Folks Were Colored. She has published articles in the Pensacola News Journal on women and leadership, sexual harassment, racial justice, and cultural diversity. She is divorced and has lived in Pensacola for 30 years, most recently with her widowed mother, Gwendolyn Miller, and her spoiled terrier, Willis. And then our final panelist is going to be Cheryl Howard. She is a co-founder and chief executive officer of the African American Heritage Society, Inc. She received her bachelor and doctorate degrees from Howard University in Washington, D.C. with honors. She has enjoyed a 33-year career, beginning as a prosecutor in the offices of the Honorable Janet Reno in Miami-Dade County, Florida, followed by years as a litigator within the private law firm sector, followed by positions within corporate, academia, and nonprofit sectors. Cheryl has demonstrated her commitment to community service, beginning when she was merely a teenager, volunteering in the Youth Auxiliary Division as a candy striper with her local hospital for several years. As a professional, she has served on the following boards: United Way of Escambia County, now known as United Way of West Florida, Pensacola State College Foundation, Legal Services of Northwest Florida, T.T. Wentworth Museum, Pensacola Chamber of Commerce, Favor House, executive committees of the Junior League of Greater Princeton and the Pensacola Junior League, supervisory committee of the Penn Air Federal Credit Union, and social and civic memberships within the Lynx Inc., Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority, and the League of Women Voters, Pensacola Bay Area. Cheryl resides with her husband, Joseph, of 33 years in Pensacola. They are the parents of 2 adult children, a daughter who is a health law attorney in Boston, Massachusetts, and a son who is vice president of a global Fortune 100 investment banking firm headquartered in New York. Having lived abroad in Canada and Europe as a corporate spouse expat for many years, Cheryl loves to travel internationally, enjoys reading, lifelong learning, dance, exercise, and yoga. So as you can see, we have a very distinguished panel with us tonight. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Karen Barber for her presentation. So Dr. Barber, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. And really want to thank the League of Women Voters for giving me the opportunity to present. This is the second time I've been able to present to your distinguished group. So appreciated the invitation back. I'm going to apologize right up front because it's 6 o'clock. I have a hard stop. I have another group that I am committed to present to. So I'm going to need to jump in the car at 6 o'clock. So I'll try and cover my content in the next 15 minutes. And I'm sorry that I'll have to come back on and watch the recorded version to hear Dr. Fisher and Dr. Howard and the rest of the discussion. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. This is. All right. All right. Can somebody give me a thumbs up or something if they can see my screen, the first slide? All right. Very good.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. We're off to a good start then. So yes, I'm Karen Barber. This is actually, I'm starting my 35th year in public education, and I absolutely love my job and really consider it just an honor and a vocation to be able to make a difference for young people. The mission in our school district is to love, educate, and prepare children for a successful future. And that is our focus every single day. And then we have challenges like the pandemic and challenges like this, the discussion and concerns about critical race theory. So as this was a national focus and then permeated down to the local level, that required me as superintendent to really do what I've done my whole career, which is to teach and educate. And then to be able to make sure that I'm providing my teachers and my staff with the correct information and the correct support. So some of what you're seeing here is actually in a training that we are providing to all of our instructional personnel this week before school starts. And then any new employees will also receive this same training. So I've taken some of the slides from that training for this presentation with you today. So in talking about what is critical race theory, and I'm sure the other presenters have discovered this as well, there are so many definitions for what critical race theory is, and there's a lot of distortion on what it is. So in looking at some reliable sources, one came from the Department of Education. And as you can see, it's a theory, according to the Department of Education, that racism is not merely the product of prejudice, but that it is embedded in American society and its legal systems in order to uphold supremacy of white persons. This is the definition from the Florida Department of Education. And I've taken that, that statement right there actually from the rule amendment that the State Board of Education passed on June the 10th. So that's where that came from. We also found another definition through Ed Week, and it really goes back to that critical race theory was actually a post-secondary course taught at the university level, and that looked at that race is a social construct, and that racism is not merely that product of an individual bias, but it's embedded in legal systems and policies. So two different definitions. What critical race theory is not, and the reason this slide exists is because there are many ways I feel that this topic has been distorted, and I want to make sure that my teachers feel comfortable with some of the content we are teaching in our classes. First of all, it's not diversity training or inclusion training. Diversity is a good thing, and we want to make sure that not only do I have a diverse workforce, but that I have a workforce that represents and connects with our students. I'm not sure why it's advancing like that. It is not teaching that one race or sex is inherently superior to the other race or sex. And it's not, this is the one bullet that is really important to me. It's not social emotional learning. There are some who dispute that critical race theory is about social emotional learning, and social emotional learning therefore is bad. Well, by state statute in the state of Florida, we must address the social emotional needs of students. And that really became part of statute after the Parkland shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School. We must address the social emotional needs of our students. We must be able to help them to advocate for themselves. At kindergarten, just saying, boys and girls, we're going to use our words. We're not going to hit our friends. We're going to take turns. And when you're upset, you need to tell me and use your words. And so it's about having civil discourse, but really being able to ask for help when you need help, and for teachers to be able to recognize when a student might be in crisis so that we can provide intervention and support for that student. And critical race theory is not incorporated into the BEST standards, and those are the state standards that are the foundation of the curriculum in the state of Florida for public schools. My training really starts out for teachers by saying this: Santa Rosa County School District educators are professionals who come to school every day to love, educate, and prepare our students for a successful future. And the health and the safety and welfare of our students is our highest priority. So right from the get-go, I want our teachers to know you are professionals, you are heroes, you came to work for Santa Rosa County School District to provide the highest quality of education. This slide is the content straight from the rule amendment that the State Board of Education passed on June the 10th, addressing critical race theory and what is required as far as instructional content. This is really based on Florida statute that's already in rule, section 1003.42, which really delineates what should be taught in Florida classrooms. Below you'll see 3A, 3B, and 3C, and this comes straight from the rule amendment that was passed and approved by the State Board of Education. And it really clarifies what are the expectations in the state of Florida, that we're going to efficiently and faithfully teach the required topics, and they must be consistent with the Next Generation Sunshine State Standards and our benchmarks for excellent student thinking standards. Those BEST standards are new in English language arts and math. And so because we have new standards, we now have new textbooks in English language arts, and we'll adopt our math textbooks incorporating the BEST standards in this next coming year. Instruction, of course, must be factual and objective, and it should not suppress or distort significant historical events. And of course, you see they've listed some of those: the Holocaust, American history as something other than the creation of a new nation based largely on universal principles stated in the Declaration of Independence. It also includes teaching about the Civil War, about Reconstruction, about the significant contributions of African Americans, of Hispanics, and of women. And then the last statement there is really important, that we efficiently and faithfully teach means facilitating discussions that are age appropriate for the maturity level of the students. So we are facilitators for student discussion. That doesn't mean that we are convincing a student to our own personal point of view. This slide comes straight from the State Board of Education regarding that rule. So this is straight from the Florida Department of Education. The amendment requires that teachers teach students how to think, not what to think. That it fosters an environment where students can think critically and for themselves. It protects them from being influenced or indoctrinated, ensures that the instruction received in the classroom is factual and objective. So when we're teaching historically accurate information about this nation's history, where we are not omitting some of the mistakes that may have happened in our country along the way. We need to be factual and we need to be objective. Let me go back to that. I'm sorry. It has a life of its own here. The amendment helps guarantee teachers serve as facilitators of classroom discussions without making students feel pressured to think a certain way, and that we also provide that well-rounded world-class education that exposes students to multiple points of view and perspectives on a litany of topics. I think that last item is extremely important, that students hear and find out about multiple viewpoints, and then they make their own decisions. So there's been some, a lot of discussion lately and concern from some about our English language arts textbook adoption. And so these slides really deal with the law when it comes to adopted material. So we actually get a textbook allocation, each school district does. 50% of that must be used on, all of it has to be used on materials that align with our standards. But we get an adoption state-approved list, and from there, we must use at least 50% of those funds for those textbooks or basals. And that's what Santa Rosa has done. And so we've adopted from the state approved lists basals for English language arts at the elementary and also the secondary level. These are vetted. Each publisher had to meet the specifications from the Department of Education. And so we're on solid ground, and I want our teachers to know that. We're teaching the standards and we're using the state approved materials. In the state approved materials, it might be interesting for you to note that here are two of the areas in which publishers had to fill this criteria. Multicultural fairness, making sure that there was balanced representation of cultures and groups in multiple settings, occupations, careers, lifestyles. The material should support equal opportunity with regard to age, color, gender, disability, national origin, race, or religion. It also looks at multicultural advocacy. The understanding and appreciation of multiple cultures extends beyond fair representation. And so both of these items needed to be addressed by the publishers in the language arts textbooks in order to be approved, which is a terrific thing. In Santa Rosa County, we have children that speak their first language. About 24 different languages we have represented in our school district from our student population. So they come from a variety of cultures, and we need to appreciate that, recognize that, and then make them feel welcome on our school campuses. There's also required curriculum, and I want to show you this because some of this somebody might interpret as being social emotional, but this is, according to our Florida statute 1003.42, required curriculum in our school district. And I'll just let you look at that list of ways in which we're meeting those needs developmentally appropriately. We also have character development that is required by state statute. And of course, social studies. It might also interest you to know that we just finished getting our results from our Florida Standards Assessment in Santa Rosa County in 21 tested areas. We are above the state average in all of those areas. And in 20 of the 21, we are in the top 5 or top 10 school districts out of 67. Not only that, but in civics, we are ranked 5th out of 67 school districts, and U.S. history, we are ranked 4th out of 67 school districts. So we are doing very, very well. I'm happy, but I'm not satisfied with those results. I want us to be number 1, and that represents student success. So again, addressing this statute has been in existence and already addressed teaching historically accurate history. But now the spotlight is on that. So let's do the best job that we can. And you can see here, we're talking about history of African Americans, as well as the contribution of Hispanics and women. So in Santa Rosa County, here's what we're expecting our teachers to do. Provide core instruction utilizing the state approved materials aligned to those standards. Assured that our English language arts materials that provide intervention for the district are district approved. Teach students how to think, not what to think, and ensure that instruction on required topics are factual and objective and do not suppress or distort historical events. We use supplemental materials as well. I mentioned to you that 50% of our textbook allocation could be used for supplemental materials beyond that adopted textbook. So we're training our teachers to ask these questions when they choose those materials. What standard are they addressing? Does it meet the requirements of the rule amendment? Are they age appropriate and grade level appropriate materials? And using this, do those materials enhance the content and background knowledge for students? And then of course, if there is a doubt, and sometimes we've got some teachers that are nervous, they want to do the right thing. So we want them to, if they have questions, to ask their administrator. So I'm going to stop sharing. What time do I have? Wow, I'm over about 2 minutes, and so I'm going to have to scoot. And I hate that I've just giving you all this information and there's no time for discussion. That's not how I usually roll. So that's so I apologize for that, but I've got to be at another training, and I'm the featured presenter for that one. So, but I want to thank you for allowing me to share, and I will be eager to turn back on my computer tomorrow morning and watch the rest of this great panel discussion.
Well, thank
Right,
you
well,
so
Yeah,
much,
thank
Dr.
you
Barber.
so much. Yes, thank you. I know we've had one question come in the chat, so I don't know if you,
I can
Can
take 30 seconds.
okay, one question. So it says, does this include teaching that there was a nation prior to the creation of like the new nation, meaning that the land was inhabited by indigenous folks prior to colonization?
Oh, of course. Yes.
Yeah. So that is in Florida standards for social.
Yes.
Yes. All right. Thank you so much. Well, yeah. So feel free. We're just glad you took the time to be with us this evening. And if anything else, if we feel like you might be the appropriate person to answer a question, we'll be sure to pass that along to you as well.
All right.
Sounds
Thank you
Okay,
so much.
you.
Have a great evening.
All right. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right. So I don't know if Professor Fisher wants to go next or if Dr. Howard wants to go next. Who would like to be the next presenter? We didn't necessarily decide ahead of
So-
time.
If I may, President of the League, Jane Spruill, asked me to just welcome everyone at the outset, and then we're going to have Professor Fisher go next. And so on Jane's behalf, she had a prior engagement with a large group of family members and is not able to be here. So we'd like to welcome all of you for being here this evening for this inaugural, the start of our year event, Hot Topics event. And to that, after that, I'd like to also go ahead now and ask Professor Fisher to go forward, indicating as well that we have somewhat of a combined presentation. There may be a little bit of overlap here and there, but she's going to address many of the same issues as I am, but from a sociologist's point of view. And I will be introducing the information from a legal and history point of view.
Okay,
So,
sounds good.
All right.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so I'm not sure.
Sometimes if you open your PowerPoint and then hit share screen, Zoom will show you a small picture of your PowerPoint, and you can select that and hit go or share.
Okay.
So that's what I do. I open the PowerPoint first, then I hit the green share screen button and choose my PowerPoint and tell it to share.
Okay, that happened. Thank you.
Okay,
That
it's
is
coming in. It's coming in now, and then you
Okay.
can just make your as you would in PowerPoint normally, make it full screen.
Okay. Let's see.
Excellent. There it is.
Okay. Okay, so let me see. I hope this little bar down here isn't in the way, but
It looks like it's in the way, but it's not visible to the rest of us.
okay, great. The definition that I have of critical race theory is pretty similar to what Dr. Barber said. It's a framework that's been used to help us understand why racial inequalities exist in our society and how we can remove them. And I gave myself a PowerPoint to use because I am a big storyteller. And those of you who know me know that I will get started telling you stories as examples of things and will get out of time. So my question is, why is this so threatening to some people? The interesting thing about this whole issue with CRT becoming such a big issue is that CRT really is a theoretical framework that came into existence like 40 years ago. And it came into existence as a legal framework. So it was actually a group of legal scholars that developed critical race theory to address inequalities that they saw in criminal justice and the legal field. And I have no idea why it suddenly became this hot topic in the Southern Baptist Convention and moved into education. But it seems rather ridiculous because it had not been something that was even prominent in public education in elementary schools. I mean, who's teaching critical race theory in elementary schools? It's really a theory that is taught at the college level and in law schools. And so by banning it, what has happened is it has made more people interested in finding out about it and discovering what it is and what it's not. And that's been a good thing. But it's been upsetting to me that we ban any kind of knowledge. It's like book burning, you know? And well, okay, so I'll move on. So CRT looks at systemic racism, the idea that there are groups of people that are the underdog and that those individuals have systemically been put in positions in our society in which they have been kept in that position of not being equal. And CRT scholars focus on the relationship between race, racism, and power in society. The first tenet of CRT holds that racism is so deeply woven into the social fabric of the US that it's not deviant. Instead, it's normal. It's a normal order of business. And that is disturbing to people. It's called critical race theory because it asks you to look critically at systems to better understand the origins of racial inequalities. And this knowledge can be used to diminish and stem the inequities at the root cause, which is the system, policy, or law. While there are similarities, CRT is an anti-bias, anti-racism education, and Dr. Barber mentioned this. It's not culturally relevant teaching. It's not diversity inclusion training. So these are things that she mentioned, and I was glad to hear her say that because there is a lot of confusion about what it is. I mentioned that it originated with legal scholars, and these are some of their names. Derek Bell, Alan Freeman, Kimberly Crenshaw, Richard Delgado, Cheryl Harris, Charles Lawrence III, Mary Matsuda, and Patricia Williams. And I have a TED Talk in which I want to introduce one of those theorists to you. And I think it will make a real difference in how you see one of the key principles of critical race theory, which is intersectionality. I need to make sure you can hear the sound. Can you hear it? Let me hear from anybody. Haley, can you hear the sound?
I did not hear it. Typically,
Okay,
I think
so
when
let me
you,
stop.
yeah, I think if you unshare and then when you reshare your screen, it'll say share sound for your computer, and then we'll
Right.
be able to hear the video.
Or
Audio.
or you can check the optimize for video button when you share, and that'll make sure that the video
Yeah.
plays well. I'm not sure, Haley, but I think maybe Professor Fisher has frozen.
Oh, yeah, she might have.
Let's see if we can get her back.
Let me see. I don't know if she turned off her sound and video in that process.
She turned off her sound and video. See if I can. So. Oh. I have a thing that says, I'm going to try this. It says ask to start video. I don't know whether that will work or not.
Oh,
Here she
there
is.
she is. No, it's like all the buttons.
Ask to unmute.
Professor Fisher.
Unmute.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, there you
Yeah,
go.
there we are.
Okay.
All right. Yeah.
In the interest of time, Professor Fisher, I know that you've done a number of talks about intersectionality, and I think you do it about as well as as Professor.
Sure.
No, I really want them to see this. Okay,
Well,
so,
if nothing else, you can always email me the
hey, can you hear it now?
URL. No, we
Well,
can't see it or hear it. I think you've stopped sharing your screen.
Okay, all right.
So when you hit share screen, there's an option for video where it says optimize for video.
Okay.
You might have to.
Okay, video,
Yeah.
share. Here. Nope, not that. Share sound. Okay.
Yep, that's it.
Let me go over to YouTube.
Nope. Okay. All right. Well, you're right. I guess I'll have to just talk about it. Because you can't see the PowerPoint now?
No, we can hear the video, I think, but
I'd
you
like to try
haven't.
something new. Those of you who are able, please stand up.
Now we can hear it.
We can hear it. We just can't see
Okay,
it.
so I'm gonna name some names.
Go.
When you hear a name that you don't recognize, you can't tell me anything about them, I'd like you to take a seat and stay seated. The last person standing, we're gonna see what they know, okay? All right. Eric Garner. Mike Brown. Tamir Rice.
Who's this person?
All right, I can make that work. Okay, it says you're sharing computer sound. So I'm going to stop share. What she does is she talks about, so I'm going to go back to the trying to share the PowerPoint.
Make sure your PowerPoint is open first so that you can pick it from the list of things you can share.
Okay, it's open.
Then go to share screen.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, and then you
So
can
you
just maximize it.
Okay. I hate that that didn't work, but
If you go to slideshow and then say from current slide,
okay.
yeah, that's it. It'll work now.
Okay. So I hate that that didn't work because she talks about a woman named whose last name was DeGraffenreid. And this woman applied for a job at a plant. And at this plant, they had, she indicated that she was not hired because she was a Black woman. And the judge denied her case because he said she either had to file as a woman or as Black. She could not, she couldn't get 2 hits at the bat, basically, was the term he used. And the facts were that they did have Black people working at the plant, but they only had Black men, and they were working in laborer jobs. They did have women working at the plant, but they were white women, and they were only working in secretarial jobs. They wouldn't hire a Black woman as a secretary, and they wouldn't hire a Black woman, they wouldn't hire a woman as a laborer. So basically, she would not be hired for a job. So it was the issue of her intersectionality that Kimberly Crenshaw recognized. The fact that she had multiple identities. We all do. We're not just women. We are women of a particular age, of a particular physicality. Some of us have disabilities. Some of us are have different ethnicities. Some of us are gay. Some of us are straight. Some of us are trans. These intersectionalities make a difference in how society treats us. Some of us are male. Some of us are white male. Some of us are males of color. Some of us are white males who are gay. And that makes a difference in how society treats us. I asked my students to create a hierarchy, and without giving them any instructions other than, I want you to list whose bodies matter more in our society. And I gave them male, female, white, Black, straight, gay, physically able, or a person with a disability, so on. I said, put them in order. And I asked everybody to do their own list. Everybody had almost the same exact list. They knew who was at the top of the list, and they knew who was at the bottom of the list without any instructions. And that's because we know what bodies matter more in this society than others. And that's because race, gender, and all of those factors are embedded in our society. So critical race theory says that these issues are deeply woven into the social fabric of the United States. And so that was one of the tenets that Kimberly Crenshaw raised. So critical race theory isn't for elementary school, although there are some CRT theorists who think it could be taught at younger ages, and that it would be good for people to talk about these things at an age when they're able to discuss things like this without feeling like they have to be confrontational or that they have to prove anything, that it's just information for them. Unfortunately, lawmakers in at least 15 states have recently introduced laws, and 5 of them have already passed laws in states that seek to prevent teachers from using CRT and any other anti-racism resources that discuss racism and social justice in school curriculum. And this is bad. CRT, I feel personally, elementary schools too young for them to process it. I mean, some college students, have a difficult time at first. I think it's good for them because I think the theoretical framework helps them to see things that are normally invisible to some people in society. But for kids, anti-racism, though, is important. The problem is that the term CRT has become a catch-all for all anti-racism curriculum, and it's become demonized and weaponized, mostly by conservatives. The truth is that the real CRT has typically been used in academia. Learning about CRT is important because in order to challenge systems of oppression, you have to first be able to identify them. CRT encourages students to become more civically engaged by equipping them with the tools they need to think critically about issues of race and racism. CRT also helps students to develop critical thinking skills, to recognize inequities in society, identify systemic racism, and learn how to enact change. So the central principles of critical race theory are that race is a social construction. It's not biological. Scientists will tell you that human beings have exactly the same genomes. I mean, if you deconstruct us, you might find 1/100,000 of us that's different between us. So race is a social construction, but it's one that has consequences for those who are raced. When we think of race, we think Black, we think people of color, but everybody has a race. It's just that some of us have a race that is considered problematic and that has connected to it negative constructions, negative stereotypes. Secondly, second principle of critical race theory is that it's embedded. Race is a normal feature of society. It's embedded in many of our public policies, systems, and institutions. And this is hard for people to take when they hear this. It's hard for them to acknowledge this. They want to think that racism is an abnormality and that race itself is, kind of irrelevant, that we are a colorblind society. But That is not true. We can tell that from the number of people that have been Black men and women that have been killed by the police. We can tell that from the criminal justice system and the impact of the numbers of people that are arrested and that are incarcerated by race. We can tell that from the number of people that have COVID. I have a list, so I'll go down the list a little later. It's systematized. Racism is not just the problem of a few bad apples. It's the system. It's not people who are racist, individuals. It is a system which has policies and which has practices that maintain inequality that we need to look at. And then another principle is the stories of the oppressed are anecdotal data. When people of color were saying we're being mistreated by the police, that there is inequality in criminal justice, people were saying, oh, you're overreacting. That when people of color were saying there's racial profiling, people didn't listen. They didn't take that seriously. When we watched George Floyd get killed on television over and over again, people began to say, wait a minute, something is not right here. How can this happen in America? This is not what we are. This is not okay. Reactions to racism are not just emotional responses by those being discriminated against. They are legitimate responses to oppression. Counter storytelling is anecdotal data. That's where you start to get information. First, you have to ask people, what is happening? What can you tell me? Researchers look at the numbers, but how do you gather the numbers without talking to the people? Then the last principle is that CRT is committed to social justice. It requires action. It requires us actually being willing to take some action to make change.
Professor Fisher, before you go on to the next slide, I was just going to tell you we would have a couple more minutes left so we can have Dr. Howard share a little bit for time.
Okay.
So just a couple more minutes and then we'll have our last speaker and then we can do some Q&A.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So some examples, Black people are incarcerated 5 times the rate of white people and for longer sentences for the same crimes. There's ample data from the Bureau of National Statistics, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, Pew Research Center, etc. There is a list. Yet when we hear anecdotal data from the groups most affected, we deny that the pattern is systemic. The war on drugs disproportionately affected, disproportionately affected people of color, and with other areas for CRT, when Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than white women. Racialized communities are hardest hit by COVID-19. Black people are 3 times more likely than white people to be killed by police. These things are not random. Why houses owned by white people are appraised at a higher value than houses owned by Black people in the same neighborhood. If I want to sell my house, realtors will advise me I need to take anything that tells the potential seller that I'm Black down. I need to get rid of all my Black art, family pictures, anything that would tip people off that a white that there is a Black owner of the house in order for the house to sell at a higher price. These things are not random. And those things are examples of the racism and that race is an embedded factor in our society. So we can talk about some of these other things as you have questions. But critical race theory isn't about blaming white people for a privilege that they have. It's about looking at how we can contend with living in a racialized system and how we can address that some people are suffering from the inequity. Changing inequity doesn't happen without acknowledging that that systemic racism exists and is embedded in our society. And once we acknowledge that it occurs, we can take action to change it. Thank you.
All righty, thank you. All right, Cheryl, if you want to go ahead and get ready for your portion.
You're on mute, Cheryl.
Haley, what time are we scheduled to finish up so that I can determine how much I need to skip? Because
I think it's at, I thought it said from 5:30 to 7:30.
Okay, great. Okay.
Yes, I think we still have plenty of time, but you know, whatever you feel that you want to
Okay.
cut out if it's already been, you know, addressed, if we don't want to be too redundant, and then that way, yeah, we have extra time for questions and answers.
Oh, that's wonderful.
I'm pretty sure it's 7:30.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. All right. Well, there will be some, as I said earlier, a little bit of overlap here and there because let me go up. Once again, as Professor Fisher's already indicated, critical race theory was created by one of the professors at Harvard Law School in conjunction with her professor at that time, Dr. Derek Bell, who I believe is no longer with us. But together in the course of considering some of the issues that have resulted in society, some of the disparities that can't be explained, they started looking at ways to understand and try to make sense of why it is that there are so many disparities between people within the same country. And so during the course of my talk, I'd like to first make note of the fact that we are nonpartisan. So the purpose of this talk is not to, as I say in all of my talks, it's not to advocate or what have you, but it's to educate. And so that's what I'm going to be doing. And I'm going to be doing that by looking at some legal principles and lawsuits and cases that the Supreme Court has decided over the years and opinions from the Supreme Court and so on in discussing this. Now, my source, as was the case with the previous presenter, is the book, the actual book, not propaganda, but actually what was written by the person who founded, was the co-founder of the principle of critical race theory. So this is the book that she co-wrote together with other scholars. And so this is my manual and my source.
Cheryl, before you continue, could we ask you to make your PowerPoint full screen? Go up to like slideshow and say from current slide. It's hard to see it.
Okay, let me do this if you don't mind, because I actually I like the thumbprints on the side because I use them to cue me for certain things before I discuss them.
Okay.
But what I can do is I can let me see if I can move it.
No, I don't think you can move it.
Well, let's see.
You can zoom in a little bit.
I know what I can
Yeah,
do.
Down at the bottom in the right, there's a plus and a minus. You can go plus to make it a little bit larger.
Ah, okay. Thank you for that. Let me see if I can find this plus and minus.
I don't see it.
I don't see it either. Oh, shucks. Let's see. Okay. Well,
Maybe if you go to view, I don't know if you can zoom and view.
The bottom right-hand corner.
Okay, how's that? Is that better?
Yeah, that's better.
Yeah.
That's
Okay.
better.
All right, we'll do that. Okay, so once again, we've heard, as Professor Fisher said, we've heard so much about what critical race theory is and so forth. So we're going to go through it and break it down and really talk about it. But what I wanted to start with is to have it actually defined by the co-creator of it, because it sounds so ominous, critical race theory, when in fact her explanation is very simple and it is verbatim. This is the person, Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, who was the co-inventor of critical race theory. Let me see if I can make this smaller. Yeah, there we go. And her definition, as I said, it's really fairly simple. It says it is the study of law and how it has been a part of the infrastructure from slavery, which by the way ended in 1865, to emancipation, to segregation, to today, upon which racial inequality has been based. CRT is an effort to think about the fact that we as a nation have had commitments to equality since 14th Amendment, which was ratified in 1868, and yet to this point, there still has not been real equality. Therefore, we're basically looking at the law and asking questions about how it has been a conduit today upon which racial inequality has been based. CRT is an effort to think about the fact that we as a nation have had commitments to equality. Could everyone, 14th Amendment, which was ratified in 1868, and
Yes.
yet to this point, there still has not been real equality. Mary, therefore, we're basically looking at the law. Mary, to mute your device, please. Today, upon which racial inequality has been based. Okay, thank you, Mary. Okay, so therefore, we're basically looking at the law and asking questions about how the law has been a conduit for racial inequality and what we need to do about law in order to bring us closer to the dreams we have as a society. So as you can see, the purpose of critical race theory is really not as ominous as it would seem. And it is a question that has to be asked, I think, at this point, because we are 156 years post-slavery, and we are still talking about things such as equality and voting rights. So the question becomes, why? So our goal regarding the presentation is to demystify the term critical race theory by doing what we have done, which is to explain really what it is. And the other two items here have already been covered. So once again, what it is not, I think everyone has agreed, it's not anti-racism education, it's not diversity and inclusion training. If you're someplace and have the ability to encourage diversity and inclusion training, please do so, because that is an entirely different thing. And it is something that's very necessary right now. And again, I have heard on so many networks, and I have seen in several newspapers that critical race theory is about advocating that we abandon free speech, and interestingly enough, that we also abandon the Equal Protection Clause, and that is not true as well. Also, from cover to cover of the book, I have not seen any place in it where it teaches that white people are bad. I think we all know that in this journey that we have been on in America for 400 years, there have always been allies of other races, and I don't like that word race, but people of other nationalities who have always been allies, were it not for the inclusion of people who identify now as white, who are in European, Anglo-Saxon, what have you. We possibly would not have had the benefit of the Underground Railroad, which was helpful in dismantling slavery. So many abolitionists were what is considered white, and have been allies from the beginning. The Grimke sisters, who were theologians, were writing treatises 100 years before slavery ended, about the abomination of it, and so many others, including the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and so many other people over the years, the Quakers, the Puritans, the Pilgrims, who are a different group altogether, have all been allies with us. So by no means would critical race theory or any of us suggest that all white people are bad. That is not a tenet of critical race theory. Also, I have heard, and as many of you, if you've watched some of the hearings that have been going on in Congress, that it's been somewhat analogized to Marxism. And Marxism is an entirely different, it's an entirely different theory altogether. And it somewhat opposes the idea of a class structure. And by no means within critical race theory is there a suggestion that there should not be classes. But I think what it is that there's this ideology as to why it is that all persons with melanin in their skin needs to be automatically placed within this one class in which all other people are in that same class, disrespecting the idea of individuality, which is something that all people seek and should feel entitled to. And that is a part of our societal structure. And so quite naturally, people of color need to be given the benefit of the doubt as well in that regard. Okay, so that's what critical race theory is not. Okay, now this is one of the gentlemen who, and I'm being kind, one of the gentlemen who is an opponent of critical race theory. I'm sure you all have probably seen him. He has been on the news pretty much daily now for several months. This is of a particular concern to me when so many people are dealing with so many things, such as the pandemic, housing, the children issue, all kinds of issues. And yet we have elevated a non-real issue into public space, whether it's physical space or mental space of parents and people that we know is not really an issue. And that is what this gentleman has done. And he tweeted this back in March. He said, after going on television and lambasting the idea of critical race theory, he then tweeted after being on someone's show, "We have successfully frozen their brand, critical race theory, into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it toxic as we put all of the various cultural insanities under that brand category." I don't know how that's helpful to society when we know that something is not true, but we continue to promote it. And that there are so many people who get their news from one outlet versus a variety of different outlets and depend on what they hear from their trusted anchor person and their guests. And so to have this knowledge and continue to promote these ideas about critical race theory is something that, as Professor Fisher said, is a huge question mark for me. And I don't understand it. But obviously, those who are promoting the idea that it is such a bad thing and such a horrible thing know better. And so, and after this talk, you will too. And I'm sure many of you already, have opinions, and you will continue to have an opinion about critical race theory. We have learned through the news that many of the people who are seen on television holding up signs and going to meetings and about critical race theory to make sure it doesn't get taught have turned out to be political activists, which is also not helpful to regular parents who are trying to make the best decisions for their children and their families. So as a result of all of this, now we can see that a good portion of the United States is looking at this non-issue instead of looking at the fact that voting rights, which so many people fought and died for and were injured for, I'm thinking about John Lewis, that those rights are being chipped away every day in probably more states than this, with the goal to be in every state. So while we're paying attention to the new shiny object on this side, voting rights are being dismantled over here. So we have to be very careful to use our critical thinking to understand what's really happening and to keep our eyes on the ball. Okay. Now, going back to some of the particular issues that are addressed or that can be explained perhaps by critical race theory, I have highlighted a number. We know that with regard to, well, first of all, we know that race is a social construct, and we do know that there is institutional racism. We all know this now, I believe. And those things have combined to perpetuate a system whereby people of color have been historically disadvantaged in the following ways with regards to economics, employment, housing, homeownership, healthcare, education, and policing. So although there are very well known and rarely, if ever, disputed disparities that exist between minority populations and the rest of our society, even though sometimes marginally these same things can affect other groups based on class and social structure. But we would agree that most often these disparities are seen in larger percentages within minority communities. And so we ask the question, why? Okay, now before I get to a lot of the cases, some of the cases that have contributed, and Haley, I'd like to ask you to please keep me on point with time. And if you give me like even a 15-minute warning, I would appreciate it. And then maybe a 10-minute warning. Would you do that, please? Hello? Uh-oh. Am I
Haley,
still?
you're muted.
I'm sorry, I was muted. So it's about 10 till 7. So if you want to take the next 10 minutes to, highlight anything from your presentation, and then we can go into the Q&A at 7. So I can give you a 5-minute warning in 5 minutes.
Okay, well, I'm going to be moving quite quickly. All right, so history time frame. It's really important to understand, and I know probably everyone on this call, this video, this call are aware of all of these dates and things anyway, so I won't go through all of them, but just knowing that in 1619, which is 402 years ago, was the beginning of the enslavement of people in America, starting in the 13 colonies. Emancipation Proclamation that was signed basically only freed African Americans who were enslaved in Confederate states. And that was after they had worked for 244 years to build America and create the wealth of America for free for 244 years. But it was actually the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution that abolished slavery throughout the US and freed enslaved African Americans all across the nation. And I've already said that's been 156 years ago. The 14th Amendment, which was ratified in 1868, granted US citizenship, and this is very important. The 14th Amendment granted US citizenship to all those born or naturalized in the US regardless of race, and it guaranteed equality before the law for all persons living in the US, whether citizens or not. In 1870, 2 years later, the 15th Amendment was ratified and removed race as a barrier to voting for all men, while allowing others to remain, other barriers, that is, to remain. In 1871, Congress was empowered by the federal government to protect the right to vote in 1871. And so I'm gonna move on to the next one here. We're going to talk about Reconstruction quickly between 1863 and 1877. That was probably the one period of time in which it is believed that African Americans really experienced equality in America because during that period of time, the first US senator was seated in Congress, and that was Hiram Revels from Mississippi, even though some former Confederate officers tried to block his ability to be seated. He was in fact seated. And I mentioned all of those things that occurred because all of that was undone. And it took only one generation to turn back all of the progress that had occurred. Reconstruction was really about 12 years, slightly less, because rights were being eroded all the time. And so right after that period of time, we have been back to where we almost really somewhat in a modified slave state sense. We're going to talk about the Black codes, if we had time, that had to do with managing Black people's, bodies and knowing where they were all of the time, and having certain rules around if someone after Reconstruction was over, if one or more Black people or African Americans were walking through town, they would have to show a letter that they were working as a sharecropper for someone. If they could not show this letter, they would be arrested and made a part of a chain gang. And so that is what then enslaved them again. And that enslavement could last for any period of time. And so that is being equated now to mass incarceration and during the period of time of stop and frisk. So as I said, we're going backwards instead of forward in many regards. These are some of the Supreme Court cases that after that period that I talked to you about, with all of the different amendments that were put into place to guarantee freedom for people. Well, in a very short amount of time, beginning in 1873, many of those cases were overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court, starting with the slaughterhouse cases, because what the slaughterhouse case said was that the federal government just really did not have time anymore to have troops in place in the South to provide protection to formerly enslaved people. And so since the formerly enslaved individuals were not afforded the 40 acres and a mule that was promised, people were released from slavery with nothing. No land, no money, no clothing, no anything, no ability to do anything, and certainly no ability to go back 8,000 miles or more across the Atlantic Ocean to the continent of Africa, which would have been very unfamiliar, since by this time none of the people still existing probably had any connections back with that country. We had been here over 200 years. So they were just basically released with nothing. And in order to keep former slave holders from massacring the previously enslaved people, the federal government had originally had the military in place to assist and sort of mediate to keep bad things from happening. And as soon as this 1873 case went before the Supreme Court that says, okay, we're abandoning Reconstruction, you're on your own, that is when lynchings and massacres, such as the Oklahoma Massacre, the Rosewood Massacre in Florida, the Ocoee, Florida Massacre, and dozens of other massacres occurred in this country. Also, very shortly thereafter, in 1883, in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, the court decided that it is okay. So what? There's the 14th Amendment. It is actually okay to discriminate against people of color, and hence the 4 white passengers and colored passenger signs became the order of the day. And this level of discrimination continued for over 100 years, where it was okay to have Jim Crow laws in America against formerly enslaved people for over 100 years. So very often when we hear people talking about critical race theory and saying, oh, it's going to make children hate America and think we're such a bad place, and they're going to think that the United States was founded on racism, that the country was founded on white supremacy. So I will skip all of my other slides because this one is the most important. The purpose behind history is so that we don't have to guess what the thoughts were of the framers of the Constitution, and equally important, those who are assigned to implement the laws that have been established. We look at the legal principles, i.e. in this case, the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court is the highest court of this land, short of an international dispute, in which case we might go to The Hague, to the World Court. But for matters that occur in this country, the Supreme Court is the final stop. And so hence, that is what we look at to determine what America believed at any period of time, because what was believed will be a part of the legal holdings of Supreme Court cases. So I will do one case. I had about 10, but I'm going to talk about one case. And I'm going to talk about the Dred Scott decision. And the reason that I'm going to talk about that decision is because it literally gives you a window into the thinking during that period of time. It was closer to the end of slavery that the Dred Scott decision was decided, but it was not at the end. Slavery was still in progress. It continued for a while after, but this case is very important. It was recently, well, not recently, a number of years ago, it was discussed by current Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer when he spoke before the Supreme Court Historical Society in Washington, D.C. And he too realized that this case was really important. And the reason that, one other reason that it was so important is that it was decided by the Supreme Court Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, whose name was Roger Taney. Former Chief Justice Roger Taney's bust still sits in Congress. It also sits in the Supreme Court. There have been movements to have it removed, but he was considered to be such a defining Chief Justice of the Supreme Court that those efforts have not been successful because he was considered to be one of the greatest thinkers of the day. In fact, you will see that when current Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer described him, he mentioned and reminded people that Judge Taney was thought to be because he was thought to be such a great thinker, he was often described as having a moonlight mind, which means that his mind gave off all of the light of day without its glare. So basically, he was a phenomenal thinker and understanding person of law. So what does Judge Taney say about the founding of the country? Well, when asked whether or not Dred Scott could sue before the Supreme Court to receive freedom after having lived in 2 free states, he states, and I can't put the whole case here because it's 250 some odd pages, but I will put this here for you. If you have access to whatever and you want to take a picture of this screen, you can pull up the case and read it for yourself. This, I would recommend you get it from law.cornell.edu because they are the official source often for laypersons to get full cases, and particularly Supreme Court cases. Okay, so you can turn to it now if you're able, and please feel free to follow with me because these are his words. He will tell us what the mindset was at the founding of this country. Okay, now moving right along, he said the question arises whether the provisions of the Constitution in relation to the personal rights and privileges to which the citizens of a state should be entitled embraced the Negro African race at the time in this country, in that time in this country, or who might afterwards be imported, who had then or should afterwards be made free in any state and put it to the power of a single state to make him a citizen of the United States and endue him with the full rights of citizenship in every other state. So basically he does ramble a bit. So I may have to cut him down a little bit from time to time, but basically the question was, can a person who is of African descent ever be a citizen of the United States? And his answer was no. The court thinks the affirmative of these propositions cannot be maintained. He explained that in the opinion of the court, the legislation and histories of the time The language used in the Declaration of Independence show that neither the class of persons who had been imported as slaves nor their descendants, whether they had become free or slaves, nor their descendants, whether they had become free or not, were then acknowledged as a part of the people, nor were they intended to be included in the general words used in that memorable instrument. He then goes on to say, this is the last one, that and this is pages 9 to 13, if you'd like to follow along. He says, for more than a century before the Negro has been regarded as being for more than a century before, the Negro has been regarded as being of an inferior order, white supremacy, and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. He was bought and sold and treated as an ordinary article of merchandise and traffic whenever a profit could be made by it. This opinion was at that time fixed and universal in the civilized portion of the white race. And in no nation was this opinion more firmly fixed or more uniformly acted upon than by the English government and English people. They not only seized them on the coast of Africa and sold them or held them in slavery for their own use, but they took them as ordinary articles of merchandise to every country where they could make a profit on them, and were far more extensively engaged in this commerce than any other nation in the world. The opinion thus entertained and acted upon in England was naturally impressed upon the colonies they founded on this side of the Atlantic, and accordingly, a Negro of the African race was regarded by them as an article of property and held and bought and sold as such in every one of the 13 colonies which united in the Declaration of Independence and afterwards formed the Constitution of the United States. So you may ask yourself, on what basis was this country founded? And we'll go from there. I think I'm out of time. I believe Professor Fisher already covered this, so I'll leave it.
Yeah.
Am I out of time now?
You are. I didn't want to interrupt you because you were kind of like regulating yourself. So
I have so many more slides. I'm so disappointed.
Oh, I know. It's hard, and I I teach this in my classes. This history. So I was like reviewing and all of that. So anyway, but yeah. So if we want to open it up now for questions, so like we kind of said at the beginning, and then if Cheryl, if you want to stop sharing your screen, because then that makes it easier for us to see the people, the participants. Okay. So you can either put your question into the chat, which we have one question I know in the chat here through Zoom, and Mary Louise is kind of checking the YouTube live as well. So we'll start with, and then of course, if you want to like unmute yourself and ask your question, we will attempt to do that. But just know we're looking for specific questions on the information that's been presented tonight. And then we're not really like getting into a formal discussion or debate or anything. So we'll start with the question that is in the Zoom chat. So the first one said, so based on the definition that we have seen tonight from you all, the panelists, it doesn't seem to address racism or inequities for brown and indigenous people. Is that correct? And then they also added Asian people. So whoever wanted to address that question, or you both can address it. So how does critical race theory address racism or inequities for brown, indigenous, or Asian people is the question.
But when it started, of course, it was 40 years ago. And so the focus was because there was really no theory in the law that specifically was addressing race. Here these students were looking at criminal justice and looking at legal issues, and nowhere were they specifically looking at the difference that race made in how the law was being implemented. And so they said, we need this. We need to look at this. And in looking at race at that time, we didn't separate into categories of ethnicity. It was people of color, and it was just race. And so when they thought about race, they were specifically looking at Black people, at African Americans, but they did include brown people because there wasn't anything else, that addressed that. Now, critical race theory is actually being used to look at not only race, but gender issues, disability issues. It's being looked at as a framework to look at other issues of inequality. So it's being broadened to look at issues beyond just Black, white, race in general, to look broader. Cheryl,
Any
did
other?
you wanna add
Yeah, do
anything?
you want to add anything else?
Well, I would agree generally, but I think that where African Americans are concerned, we've always had a wide net. We've always opened up our concerns and considerations and our willingness to take on and include anybody else that we feel has been disenfranchised. And so to that extent, I have seen many writings, not specifically in this case, as Professor Fisher indicated, but many writings from that period of time and discussions, even by Derek Bell, who was the co-founder of this, who specifically took issue with the manner in which Indigenous people were treated. As many people know, many Indigenous groups and both really enslaved Africans and then later African Americans were united, sometimes even in their living conditions. And many times Indigenous people were very assistive in terms of helping escaped enslaved people during the underground period of the Underground Railroad. Now, we do also know, or some people at least know, that sadly enough, in a last ditch effort, I guess I'll say, to show the colonists that they could assimilate to a different standard, some groups of Indigenous people did take on slaves. And so the Trail of Tears consisted of Indigenous people who were leaving with their slaves, their enslaved Africans, packed like horses and packed like, were basically their burden bearers as they all moved west. So I think we need to be aware of that. And I think that was a way of just begging to please not be more annihilated than they already were. See, we can assimilate, sort of. But there are a lot of complexities. And in fact, Indigenous people are discussed in the Dred Scott decision also, but basically sort of in a more offhanded manner of, well, these were the savages and we basically staked a claim on their land. And now as long as they're in territories, they're not under the control of the Constitution because they are being viewed more as a foreign nation within the United States. And so we don't have to worry about them right now, but they
Until we want their land.
In the Dred Scott decision. Yeah. So, and with regard to Asian Americans, there was an attempt also to align with Asian, Chinese particularly, and during that same period of time. So
Richard Delgado was one of the other people who was actively involved with critical race theory. And so there were several people of color who were involved with that, not just Black people. So yeah, the thing was during that time, we didn't separate race and ethnicity. It was just people of color, and it wasn't until later that the government came up with this separation. You're either a race or you're an ethnicity. And so when we said race, we were talking about Hispanics. There was no Mexican, like everybody was lumped together, and that we were talking about them as a race, as a racial group, even though we recognized that it was culture, because that's the way the law was defining them at the time.
Mhm. All right, well, thank you. So we do have another question that's come in. So the next one says, also healthcare disparities. So many non-white people are often not given the opportunity to receive transplants at the same rate as white individuals. How can we get CRT to the medical associations and boards, or even the government, to try to begin to address these disparities?
May I take that one, Ross?
Sure.
There are so many issues with regards to healthcare and African Americans. When we look at the news, it sounds like, sort of like, well, what's wrong with those people? Why would they just have the vaccine? Why don't they just go to the doctor? Well, there's a reason for that. With regard to men, from 1932 to 1970, men were, African American men were experimented with regard to the Tuskegee study. They were allowed to linger with syphilis while the United States Public Health Service and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention claimed to be treating them with injections and medications, all of which were placebos. And they were basically watching them to see how sick they would get. And at what point would they lose their minds, since mental illness was also an expected effect of syphilis. So then when we wonder then why Black men, and particularly very often, just don't even want to go to the doctor. But this happened. And also with regard to women, the gynecologist who's considered to be the founding father of gynecology, James Marion Sims, he became the founding father of gynecology because during slavery, he would have enslaved women one at a time at different periods, when one would finally die, then another one, but he would have enslaved women at his medical practice. And I apologize, and I would like to give a warning now. If you're someone who does not like to hear anything that's too specific, you may want to mute me. But he would have a woman who would be fully disrobed on the medical examination table on all fours. And he would have a speculum inserted in her private parts to look into her body to do medical experiments. And any other doctor who wanted to come in and, as he put it, take a turn with the speculum to open her up could. And all leading upstanding white men in the town could also come and look into her body. And when he was given the title of having been the founding father of gynecology, he wrote that I saw everything as no man had ever seen at the expense of these women. And he would scald their uteruses during the surgeries, would not give any anesthesia, because we all know Black women don't feel pain. Okay, that's a joke. But he felt like it was not worth, in his words, it was not worth using anesthesia for vaginal surgery on African women because it was not painful enough to justify the trouble for them. So that's, this can be read about in more detail by the book called Medical Apartheid by medical ethicist Harriet A. Washington. And then finally, the irony behind all of that is the introduction of the HeLa cells. Are you all familiar with the HeLa cells? I know Dr. Montgomery is. Well, HeLa, and that had to be abbreviated stands for Henrietta Lacks. She is the only woman that we know of in person, for that matter, in the history of medical science, who has had cells that are immortal. And her cells were extracted from her cervix when she was being treated at Johns Hopkins Hospital many years ago, 100 years ago, in August, 100 years ago. They harvested her cells without her permission, but because they saw how amazing these cells were and that they could withstand anything, and they would keep replicating. So these are the only cells for which medical research can be done over and over and over, and you still have your same basic source. So as a result of that, there are over 17,000 patents that are based on the HeLa cells. And guess what? She is an African-American woman who lived in Baltimore, Maryland. And as I said, they didn't get her permission. She died about a year later. Her descendants, her children and grandchildren and nieces and nephews have received, up until recently, 0. And these HeLa cells are sent out to pharmaceutical companies at the rate of 20,000 per week, sometimes in tubes. And it has made billions, with a B, billions of dollars for the pharmaceutical industry. And so this is another issue that exists within our society. The idea that it is okay to use what African-American people have, but not have them share in any of that wealth that may result from it. And that's okay, because it is deemed as, they're not deserving. And this is just the history. This is the history. And this, I can't share, but this is a picture. Oh, can you see her? Henrietta Leaks?
No.
Mm-hmm.
Just a little bit, yes.
Just a little bit, yep.
Yes.
Yeah. We
Yeah.
did have another question come in, since we have about 10 minutes left. So this might be a good one to kind of maybe have some final wrap-up thoughts in case anyone has other questions. But it says, my wife recently shared a statistic with me from a recent Pew Research study, which shows 90% of white parents don't talk to their kids about race, while 90% of Black parents do. And the says, I'm curious, given the conversation about CRT education in K through 12, and as a white father of 4, how would you recommend parents teach their children about these issues outside of the classroom, particularly if they're white parents?
I think that one thing to understand is that the reason why that is so is because for Black parents, they know that for their children, this could be a life or death issue. That if your kids don't know some basic things about being Black, that it's a different world for you, or being a child of color, it's a different world for you, that could be, could result in harm for you. Not only things like getting stopped by the police if you're driving, but one time when my ex-husband and I were driving, we were taking a trip and we stopped at a convenience store somewhere, and we just stopped to use the bathroom. And of course, I felt like we should buy something. So we were getting like some candy or gum or something. And the clerk said, would you like a sack? And I said, yes. And he said, no. And we looked at each other. And so I said, yes, please give me a sack. And so she gave me a sack. And so we got to the car. He said, why did you want a sack for some gum? He said, that's just wasting, we don't want to, that could be recycled. And I said, because when Black kids went into stores, our parents told us, always get a sack and a receipt. Because if you didn't, you might be accused of shoplifting. Because even if they knew you paid for something, sometimes you were accused by people in the store because they thought it was funny or because they just wanted to get more money from you. And it was dangerous not to have a receipt and a sack. And he was like, he said, you Americans and your race issues, he said, it's just crazy to me. Well, he was from Jamaica, and so he didn't have the same issues. So I think white parents should talk to their kids about that. They should say, you know, the experience that we all have in the world is different based on, you know, things like what, you know, how rich we are, how poor we are, and what our race is, because people treat us differently. If we have a disability or don't have a disability, people might treat us differently. And it's good for us to be loving and kind to people who are not like us, but to understand that they may have a different experience of the world that may make them a little more unsure if we're really, you know, kind or not. I mean, I think it's good for parents to talk to their kids about race and about differences, different experiences people have of the world. It's not easy, but it's important. And unfortunately, the fact that we all had to watch George Floyd die over and over again on television maybe was the first time that some of us realized how different the world is for some people.
And if I may, if I can just pick up on the last part of it, because I won't change the parenting information. I think that for those of us this time last year who were in almost a state of shock, I know I was, it's one thing to know about police, you know, things that occur at the hands of police officers sometimes, and what happened with George Floyd, you hear about it. As a former prosecutor, I will say I was one of those people a long time ago who my first response will be, well, what did he do? You know, he must have done something. What did she do? She must have done something. You know, that's how we're socialized to believe that if there's an interaction, particularly a negative interaction, that the person must have done something. And so when we watched this person have his life extinguished in such a casual fashion with this, he wasn't struggling. There wasn't like a, you know, this major altercation, like some kind of an action movie where they did battle and he ended up dead. He was restrained. His hands were behind his back. He was, you know, on his face. You know, he was immobilized, but yet he was literally extinguished before our very eyes for approximately 9 minutes. So I think that what happened during that time did in fact raise the consciousness of a number of people, and it changed things in such a way that I feel like we were on the trajectory. We were on our way to start having important conversations and being open to a different mindset and being aware that there could be other answers beyond what we automatically know, because we all have different backgrounds. And so everybody, you know, we have other experiences that we bring to the table. And so now all of a sudden we're talking to each other, we're in conversation groups, and we're trying to learn more. And right when all of this important discussion and time period and reckoning is occurring, we're thrown this non-issue of critical race theory into the mix. And so what I say about that is that the importance of understanding history is to try to ensure that you don't live it over and over and over again, because this is what has happened routinely every time that there are certain advances in which society seems to be at the precipice of uniting in this country. Something else will happen that pulls us apart, and all of a sudden we have another bad guy, good guy situation. And we have to be aware of this. Whoever thought that just 12 years after the Emancipation Proclamation and the end of slavery, with that period of time in which there were dozens of African American men participating within the government as congressmen and senators, US representatives in Washington, even locally. It was the only time that Pensacola ever actually had a Black mayor. Did you all know that? Was during Reconstruction. And so when these advances were being made, they're not at the expense of anybody else. For those of you who travel, and I think probably everybody on this call does, when you're flying, don't you see how expansive this country is? There is enough here for all of us. There's enough here. There is plenty available. And there's plenty more work that still needs to be done. And we need bodies to do it when we're willing to do it. And we're not going to, unless something really bad happens, we're not going to run out of resources. African Americans are 13, that's 1/3% of the population of America. Equal justice in housing, economics, education, healthcare, and all of these other things that any human being would want to enjoy is not going to disenfranchise the rest of America. 13%. That's it. It is not
I haven't seen any other like questions come through, although they did, a couple people asked about the PowerPoint presentation, since I know y'all kind of got short on sharing all of the wonderful information that you'd prepared for tonight's hot topic, but Mary Louise will work on following up with you and getting permission to potentially post those on the League's website. So just like stay tuned for that so that you can kind of look through those materials on your own once they get posted in the recording and everything. So just with the last couple of minutes, I didn't see any other like questions other than just like some really great points that you, as you all were sharing your comments to our few questions. And so if there's not anything else, we just want to say thank you all again so much for joining us. The League, wanted to kind of kick off the year, with our hot topics typically are, whatever's happening, like a kind of a current event. And we certainly have been hearing lots of information about critical race theory. And it was great to hear what it is and what it is not. So hopefully you learned something that you can go out and share with others, with you all. And then just if you're League members, meetings and everything for September are being finalized. So we'll be, kind of resuming our normal meeting schedules. And we're hoping September, the third Saturday of the month at the Tryon Library will actually be in person. And we're planning for a legislative roundup since the session starts a little early. So we're working on getting either our local delegation or some of their representatives from their staff to come and share with us about the Florida legislature and what should we be expecting happening next year, starting in January. So it's a little bit early. So if we don't have anything else, Mary Louise, do you have any other?
No, there were no questions.
I think this is, so then that will end our meeting.
Yes,
so thank you all again for attending and
Yes.
listening and asking your great questions.
And thank you to panelists for being so
Yes, and
gracious
thank you
to
to our speakers.
spend all
Yes.
that time.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I will go ahead and end the meeting. And again, you can watch this on
you.
YouTube or Facebook starting tomorrow.
All right.
Come on.